East Los Angeles did not become a battleground overnight. Long before police helicopters and gang injunctions, the streets east of the Los Angeles River were shaped by exclusion, redlining, and the quiet understanding that opportunity stopped at invisible borders. Mexican-American families crowded into aging housing projects and tightly packed neighborhoods, cut off from economic mobility and viewed with suspicion by the institutions meant to protect them. For young men growing up in this environment, identity was forged on the sidewalk. Loyalty was learned early, and respect was not given. It was taken. In the years after World War II, East LA became a pressure cooker. Returning veterans found few jobs. Schools were overcrowded. Police harassment was routine, and trust between the community and law enforcement barely existed. Neighborhoods became self-contained worlds, each with its own rules and protectors. It was here that street gangs emerged not only as criminal groups, but as social structures, families built from necessity. Protection, reputation, and survival became intertwined. One of those groups formed in the Hazard Avenue housing projects. Big Hazard was born from a tight cluster of families who had lived together for generations. Unlike sprawling gangs that absorbed outsiders, Big Hazard's strength came from bloodlines, childhood bonds, and an intense sense of ownership over a few square blocks. To be Big Hazard was not just to claim territory, it was to defend home. The projects were not symbolic ground. They were lived-in spaces, filled with mothers, grandparents, and siblings. Any threat to that space was personal. Big Hazard's early identity was defined by cohesion. Members grew up together, went to the same schools, fought the same enemies, and often ended up in the same jail cells. That familiarity bred discipline. Decisions were rarely impulsive, and loyalty was enforced not through numbers, but through expectation. Once someone wore the name, there was no half-stepping. Respect inside the gang mattered as much as respect on the street. Just a few miles away, a very different power was forming. Maravilla was not a single gang, but a collective identity, one that encompassed multiple cliques spread across a wide stretch of East LA. Names like White Fence, Ford Maravilla, Arizona Maravilla, and others all operated under the broader Maravilla umbrella. This structure made Maravilla massive, influential, and feared. While each clique maintained its own leadership and traditions, they shared a common name, history, and sense of dominance. Maravilla's reach gave it an advantage that few gangs could match. Numbers mattered. Reputation traveled fast. When conflict arose, Maravilla could draw from a deep pool of soldiers across multiple neighborhoods. That scale made them powerful, but it also made them vulnerable to internal friction. Unity was more symbolic than absolute, and not every clique moved with the same discipline or restraint. Graffiti told the story before bullets ever did. Walls, alleys, and underpasses became newspapers of the street, marking territory and broadcasting intent. Big Hazard's markings were tight, deliberate, and fiercely defended. Maravilla's tags spread wider, layered over entire neighborhoods. Crossouts were acts of war. A single line through a rival's name could trigger weeks of violence. To outsiders, it looked like vandalism. To those inside, it was a public declaration of dominance. At first, the relationship between Big Hazard and Maravilla was tense but controlled. Boundaries were understood. Encounters ended in fights rather than funerals. But as younger generations came up, the old rules began to erode. Teenagers hungry for reputation pushed deeper into rival territory. Small incidents, stolen bikes, schoolyard fights, verbal disrespect, began to stack on top of one another. Each offense carried the weight of history, even when the participants barely understood where the hatred began. By the late stages of this early period, the streets of East LA were divided not just by geography, but by inherited animosity. Big Hazard viewed Maravilla as an encroaching force, too large, too aggressive, and too willing to test boundaries. Maravilla saw Big Hazard as defiant, stubborn, and unwilling to bow to the natural order of numbers and influence. Pride hardened on both sides. What began as neighborhood identity was quietly transforming into something darker. The conditions were set. The names were written on the walls, and beneath the surface of everyday life, school mornings, family barbecues, corner stores, two forces were moving toward a collision that would define East Los Angeles for decades to come. By the time the rivalry between Big Hazard and Maravilla entered its second phase, the lines were no longer theoretical. They were physical, emotional, and enforced with violence. East Los Angeles had become a patchwork of invisible borders, streets you did not cross, parks you did not linger in, and alleys that could mean death if entered at the wrong time. Everyone in the neighborhood knew where Big Hazard territory ended and where Maravilla influence began. Crossing those lines was an act of intent. The first serious confrontations did not erupt in spectacular fashion. They started small and close to home, chance encounters at liquor stores, schoolyards, and bus stops. Fights broke out over looks, words, and perceived disrespect. But unlike earlier scuffles, these clashes did not end when fists stopped flying. Each incident was reported back to older members, logged mentally, and folded into a growing list of unpaid debts. Graffiti once again became the opening weapon. Maravilla cliques began pushing their markings closer to Hazard Avenue, testing reactions and measuring response times. Big Hazard responded swiftly, crossing out names and replacing them with their own. The walls became battlegrounds overnight. Entire blocks were repainted in defiance, only to be retaken hours later. Every crossed-out tag was a message. You are not welcome here, and we are watching. Retaliation followed patterns that hardened with each exchange. A beating demanded a beating in return. A shooting attempt required something louder, something final. Drive-bys, once rare, became tools of intimidation. Vehicles rolled slowly through rival streets, passengers scanning sidewalks and porches. Sometimes shots were fired. Sometimes the message was simply presence. Either way, fear began to settle into the community like a permanent fog. Maravilla's size began to show its weight during this phase. When one clique was hit, others responded, even if they were not directly involved. That collective identity made Maravilla appear everywhere at once. Big Hazard, by contrast, leaned into its unity. Every response was calculated. They did not strike often, but when they did, it was deliberate and personal. Names were known, faces were remembered. Law enforcement took notice as the body count began to rise. Patrols increased, but their presence did little to slow the momentum. To many residents, police were outsiders who arrived after the damage was done. Witnesses stayed silent. Families locked their doors earlier. Children learned to drop to the floor at the sound of gunfire. Violence was no longer shocking. It was expected. Respect became the central currency of the feud. A single insult could outweigh weeks of calm. Younger members were pressured to prove themselves, not just to their own gang, but to the memory of those already lost. Getting put on meant more than initiation. It meant demonstrating a willingness to spill blood for the name. Backing down was not an option. To hesitate was to invite attack. As months turned into years, the rivalry shed any remaining pretense of restraint. What had once been neighborhood defense was now open hostility. Big Hazard and Maravilla were no longer reacting to incidents. They were anticipating them. Weapons were carried daily, lookouts were posted. Every unfamiliar car was treated as a threat. By the end of this phase, East Los Angeles was locked into a cycle that fed on itself. Each act of violence justified the next. Each funeral planted the seeds for another. The war between Big Hazard and Maravilla had moved beyond personal disputes and into something far more dangerous. A conflict sustained by pride, memory, and the unspoken belief that only total dominance could bring safety. The war reached its most dangerous phase when restraint disappeared entirely. What followed was not a series of isolated incidents, but a sustained period of open gang warfare that reshaped daily life in East Los Angeles. By this point, the rivalry between Big Hazard and Maravilla had taken on a life of its own. Violence was no longer reactive, it was preemptive. Striking first became a survival strategy. Shootings escalated in frequency and intensity. Daytime attacks replaced nighttime caution. Busy streets, corner stores, and front yards turned into ambush sites. Vehicles slowed just long enough for gunfire to erupt before disappearing into the maze of side streets. Some attacks were precise, aimed at known rivals. Others were chaotic, driven by adrenaline and fear, leaving innocent people wounded or dead. Revenge became institutionalized. When a member fell, the expectation of retaliation was immediate and absolute. There was no debate about whether to respond, only when and how. Lists of targets circulated quietly. Word spread through whispers and trusted messengers. Every act of violence created ripples that extended far beyond those directly involved, drawing in cousins, friends, and entire cliques. Young members bore the brunt of this phase. Teenagers barely out of middle school were handed weapons and responsibilities once reserved for seasoned veterans. Many were driven by grief, having lost brothers or close friends to the conflict. Others were chasing reputation, believing that fear was the only shield available. The line between defender and aggressor blurred until it no longer mattered. Paranoia became a way of life. Members slept in different locations each night. Windows stayed covered. Cars were swapped frequently. Any unfamiliar face was treated as a potential assassin. Even within their own neighborhoods, no one felt completely safe. The psychological toll was immense, but it was rarely acknowledged. Vulnerability was a liability that could get someone killed. Civilians paid a heavy price. Families living near contested blocks found bullet holes in their walls and shell casings in their driveways. Children learned the sound of gunfire before they learned multiplication tables. Mothers avoided certain routes, even if it meant walking miles out of the way. Entire streets emptied after dark, turning neighborhoods into ghost zones. Maravilla's internal structure began to show strain under the pressure. Not all cliques agreed on strategy or targets. Some wanted to escalate further, others to pull back and regroup. Those disagreements sometimes turned inward, weakening coordination at critical moments. Big Hazard, smaller and more centralized, exploited those fractures, striking selectively and disappearing before large-scale retaliation could form. The law enforcement, overwhelmed by the pace of violence, shifted tactics. Gang units compiled intelligence, mapped networks, and tracked vehicles. Raids became more frequent. Probation and parole sweeps flooded the streets with flashing lights and sirens. But arrests rarely brought peace. Removing one player often elevated another, younger and more reckless. By the height of this phase, the war had consumed its original purpose. Territory mattered less than reputation. Survival mattered less than not appearing weak. Both Big Hazard and Maravilla were trapped in a conflict where the only acceptable response to loss was more blood. East Los Angeles was no longer just home. It was an active war zone, and everyone living within it felt the weight of a feud that seemed impossible to end. As the violence reached levels that could no longer be ignored, the battlefield began to shift. What had started on street corners and alleyways followed its participants into county jails, state prisons, and eventually the federal system. Incarceration did not pause the feud between Big Hazard and Maravilla. It transformed it. Behind bars, the rivalry took on new rules, new consequences, and far greater stakes. Inside Los Angeles County Jail, enemies were suddenly confined within the same walls. Housing assignments became matters of life and death. Fights broke out in day rooms, showers, and recreation yards, often with improvised weapons. Deputies struggled to separate rivals, but overcrowding made total segregation impossible. Every transfer carried risk. Every lockdown was temporary. Prison politics added another layer of complexity. Both Big Hazard and Maravilla members now operated under the shadow of larger, more powerful prison organizations. The Mexican Mafia, which exerted influence over Southern California street gangs, became an unavoidable force. Street rivalries were scrutinized, managed, and sometimes exploited. Violence that was once spontaneous now required approval, or at least tolerance, from higher powers. For Big Hazard, its tight-knit structure translated well behind bars. Members already trusted one another, followed clear lines of authority, and understood discipline. That cohesion allowed them to navigate prison politics with relative stability. Orders were followed. Mistakes were costly, but rare. Survival depended on unity. Maravilla's size, once its greatest advantage on the street, became a liability inside. Different cliques brought different loyalties, grudges, and interpretations of protocol. Disputes that began outside sometimes reignited behind bars, forcing intervention from prison leadership. Maintaining cohesion across multiple factions proved difficult under constant surveillance and pressure. Meanwhile, law enforcement escalated its response. Gang injunctions restricted movement, association, and even clothing in certain neighborhoods. Surveillance increased. Wiretaps, informants, and long-term investigations replaced reactive policing. Prosecutors began building conspiracy cases designed to dismantle entire networks rather than target individual crimes. Federal indictments followed. RICO statutes allowed authorities to frame the Big Hazard-Maravilla conflict as organized criminal activity rather than street violence. Leaders were singled out. Long sentences removed key figures from the streets for decades at a time. Courtrooms replaced corners as the primary arenas of confrontation. The impact on the neighborhoods was immediate but incomplete. With many veterans locked away, younger members filled the vacuum. Some attempted to revive the intensity of earlier years. Others lacked the connections, discipline, or backing to sustain it. Violence became more sporadic, less coordinated, but no less dangerous. Families felt the weight of this phase in a different way. Prison visits replaced funerals. Phone calls carried coded language and unspoken fears. Children grew up knowing their fathers through glass partitions and collect calls. The war was no longer just about survival on the street. It was about endurance through absence. By the end of this period, the feud had been fundamentally altered. It no longer burned at the same visible intensity, but it had not disappeared. It had hardened, institutionalized, and spread across generations. The streets were quieter, but the conflict had simply moved into a deeper, more entrenched phase, one where consequences lasted lifetimes rather than moments. By the time the violence between Big Hazard and Maravilla began to fade from headlines, it was not because the feud had been resolved, but because it had exhausted itself. Decades of retaliation, incarceration, and loss had drained both sides of the manpower and momentum that once fueled open warfare. The streets of East Los Angeles grew quieter, but the silence carried weight. It was the calm of a conflict that had burned too long to continue at full force. Gang injunctions, long prison sentences, and constant surveillance changed daily life. Members who once moved freely were now restricted in where they could gather, who they could associate with, and how visibly they could represent their set. Violations brought swift consequences. For many, the cost of continuing the war had become higher than the perceived reward. Survival required adaptation. Aging played its role. Many of the figures who drove the feud were no longer young men. Some were serving life sentences. Others were buried. A few quietly stepped away, carrying scars both visible and unseen. The next generation inherited the name, but not always the same appetite for endless conflict. Loyalty remained, but it competed with new realities, family responsibilities, economic pressure, and the understanding that prison was no longer a temporary risk, but a near certainty. Yet the rivalry never truly disappeared. The history lingered in stories told at backyard gatherings, in warnings passed down to younger members, and in the careful way certain streets were still avoided. Even years after major incidents had ceased, a chance encounter or a disrespectful gesture could reignite old tensions. Peace, such as it was, existed more as an understanding than a truce. For the community, the legacy was deeply personal. Entire neighborhoods had grown up under the shadow of the feud. Children learned fear before freedom. Families mourned quietly, often without justice or closure. Trust in institutions and neighbors, even in the future, had been eroded by years of unchecked violence. The Big Hazard versus Maravilla conflict stands as a case study in how street rivalries evolve into generational wars. What began as identity and territory became a cycle sustained by memory, pride, and loss. Every act of violence created the conditions for the next, until the original reasons no longer mattered. In the end, there were no victors. Territory changed hands, reputations rose and fell, but the cost was irreversible. Lives were cut short. Futures were erased. East Los Angeles survived the feud, but it was forever shaped by it. The walls may be repainted, and the gunfire may have faded, but the history remains, written into the streets, carried in the memories of those who lived it, and echoed in every reminder that when violence becomes inheritance, it outlives everyone who started it. In the aftermath of the Big Hazard Maravilla War, law enforcement shifted from reaction to domination. The goal was no longer to stop individual crimes, but to permanently dismantle the structures that allowed gangs to survive across generations. East Los Angeles became one of the most heavily monitored gang landscapes in California, with specialized units dedicated solely to mapping relationships, tracking movements, and building long-term cases. Police crackdowns intensified through coordinated operations involving local departments, county task forces, and federal agencies. Probation and parole sweeps became routine, often resulting in dozens of arrests in a single night. Search warrants were executed simultaneously across multiple neighborhoods to prevent warnings from spreading. Surveillance cameras, license plate readers, and confidential informants replaced traditional patrols as the primary tools of enforcement. Gang injunctions reshaped daily life for Big Hazard and its rivals. These civil orders restricted members from associating with one another, appearing in designated safety zones, or displaying gang-related symbols. Simple actions, standing with friends, wearing certain colors, or attending neighborhood gatherings, could result in arrest. For Big Hazard, whose identity was rooted in tight social bonds and shared space, Injunctions were especially disruptive. The projects that once served as a base became heavily policed zones where presence itself was a liability. Maravilla and its associated cliques faced a different kind of pressure. Their wide footprint made them visible, but also fragmented. Injunctions and mass arrests weakened coordination between cliques, forcing many to operate independently. Without consistent leadership or unified direction, some Maravilla factions faded, while others splintered into smaller crews with less influence and discipline. The collective identity remained, but its power was diminished. Federal prosecutions delivered the most lasting blows. RICO cases targeted not just shooters, but shot callers, those accused of directing violence, collecting money, and maintaining order. Long sentences removed experienced leadership from both sides. In some cases, entire generations of members disappeared into the prison system, leaving gaps that were never fully refilled. As Big Hazard weakened, neighboring gangs attempted to test its territory. But the era of open conquest had passed. Heavy police presence and instant retaliation from authorities made expansion risky. Instead of large-scale wars, conflicts became brief and localized, often ending as quickly as they began. Survival replaced dominance as the primary objective. Maravilla's post-war evolution followed a similar path. Some cliques sought relevance through alliances, others through low-level criminal activity that avoided attention. The days of mass mobilization were largely over. Younger members inherited names that carried history, but fewer opportunities to act on it without severe consequences. By the time the dust settled, East Los Angeles had entered a new phase. Violence did not vanish, but it changed form. The large, defining wars of the past were replaced by quieter, more controlled conflicts shaped as much by law enforcement as by gang ambition. The streets were no longer ruled solely by reputation and firepower, but by surveillance, paperwork, and prison sentences. The Big Hazard Maravilla War ended not with peace, but with pressure. It was law enforcement, demographics, and exhaustion that finally brought the conflict to a close. What remained were weakened gangs, fractured communities, and a cautionary legacy. Proof that even the most entrenched street wars can be smothered, not by resolution, but by relentless control.